Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make a gluten-free sourdough starter. And then of course after we've made the starter and fed it and watered it and all of those things, let it sit for a while, we'll make some sourdough bread. You want a whole grain flour. So brown rice flour works really good. Teff flour, sorghum flour, millet flour, or quinoa flour. Those would all work really good for a sourdough starter. Or at least those are the ones that I have used. So all you need is just really minimal ingredients. I save jars. I don't know if you save jars. Any jar will work. This is about a quart size jar. And it doesn't even need to have a lid. I choose this size of jar. In fact, even with this size of a jar, I did have one time that my sourdough starter bubbled up so much it came out the top. But I feel like this size of a jar is the perfect size because you'll be feeding your starter. But there's even been times where if my starter doesn't do what it's supposed to in the first few days and I've noticed that it's getting too full, I will dump some of it out just so it doesn't get so full to the top. But there's only been one time that my jar has exploded out the top. So that's pretty good, which means it was a really active starter. And I always label it. So this is brown rice. In the past, when I've done different flours, just in case you forget which flour you used, or there's actually been times where I've done 2 or 3 different starters at a time. But this way, you know what it is sitting on your counter. So all we're gonna do is a half a cup of brown rice flour. Some of the research I've done on sourdough breads, whether it's with a wheat starter or a gluten-free starter, it really seems to be interesting that there's different equivalents that people use. I've seen some sourdough recipes that use 2 cups of water and 2 cups of flour. Some recipes use 1 cup of water and 1 cup of flour. And this one that I use is a half a cup of flour and a half a cup of water because it seems more manageable to me than 1 or 2 cups. But if you are interested in doing that, just research a little bit more and see what method would best fit your needs. Oh, almost forgot. The other thing that I do is I have a notebook. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed this twice a day, every day. So what I'll do is I'll write the date and then I'll put day 1 in the morning. And then I will add in my flour. And this is spring water. It's filtered spring water. You can also use distilled water, but from what I've researched and what I found is you don't want to use regular tap water. Sometimes the treatments that they do, such as chlorine, will kill the natural yeast in your starter. So we'll stir that together in just a minute. So what I do is I write the date down and then I write down what the flour is that I'm using and just go from there. And then this will be in the morning, so this will be my first feed. And there's information to use a wooden spoon and not to use metal to stir it, although I do use metal to scoop it out. And then I've got some cheesecloth here and a rubber band. And that's all you need to do. But I don't usually see any changes until about day 3. But it really depends on the temperature of your house. It depends on the weather. There's so many things that can affect this. Here in Utah where I live, it's really dry. And my kitchen is always cold. So when I start making a sourdough starter, I actually put mine in the basement. Which sounds really contradictory because most basements are colder than the rest of the house. But my basement is warmer than the rest of my house. So I'll get my starter going and then I'll stick it in the basement, and then in the evening when I go to feed it again, I'll note any changes. If it has bubbles, if it didn't do anything, if it separated, because sometimes it will separate. So I just keep a notebook, AM and PM, and what day I'm on. And I've had some starters that have been ready after 3 days. And I also have had some starters in the past that are on about day 9 before they've done enough activity that I feel confident using them in a recipe. So all we do is just pour in your water to your flour and give it a really good stir. And if you can't find any cheesecloth, I've also seen recipes that people are using just a tea towel. And even with my cheesecloth, it's kind of a fine-ish cheesecloth. So there we go. That's all there is to starting your starter. I will show you the progression that this makes every day up until when we're ready to use it in a recipe. Day 3 of my brown rice sourdough starter, and you can see it's very fluffy. It has bubbles. There's also some liquid down here. It doesn't really have an odor, but it will. The next couple of days it should develop a pretty strong odor. But I'm going to discard probably about 1/3 of this. And then with a rubber spatula, I'm going to scrape down the sides of the jar just to keep it a little bit cleaner and so I can see what's happening inside of the jar. So another 1/2 cup of brown rice flour, 1/2 cup of spring or distilled water. Give it a really good stir. And now that I'm stirring it around, it does have a slight odor. So now we'll cover it back up. And I'm going to write in my notebook what it looked like and what I did. Day 4 of my brown rice sourdough starter. I tap it on the counter to see if it will bubble. And it's not really bubbling, which is just fine. And you'll see how it's a little bit separated here. So we'll go another 1/2 cup of brown rice flour and 1/2 cup of spring water, spring or distilled water. And you'll notice how full my jar is getting. And hopefully this won't expand and spill out over the top, which has happened before. But we'll see. Cover it back up. I'll put this in a bowl or on a plate, just like this, in case it decides to expand and come out the top. No bubbles. But it's very full, so I am going to discard probably about 1/2 of this. And you really want to make sure to scrape down the sides because it will get moldy. And give it a really good stir. Day 5 of my brown rice sourdough starter. No bubbles. But you can see that it is separated here. And even though I've scraped down my jar, you can still see that there is a little bit left on there. So I'm going to put it into a clean jar today. And you'll notice it's very thick. And I'm making a mess of my new jar already. Get a new label. There we go. Turn this around so you can see. Very slight bubbling. Because it is so full, I am going to discard probably about down to here. Give it a really good stir. Day 6. You can see bubbles. And when I tap it, tiny little bubbles come to the surface. Write down what I'm doing. Half cup of flour, half cup of water, and give it a really good stir. Very slight bubbles, and you saw how bubbly it is down here. I'm going to discard and put it in a clean jar. Half cup of brown rice flour, half cup of water, day 7 of my sourdough starter. Lots of bubbles. Discard and clean jar. Half cup of flour and half cup of water. I'm going to discard just a little bit. So here we are, day 8 of my brown rice sourdough starter. So in this bowl right here, I've got 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed, and I've just added 3 tablespoons of hot water. So I'm just going to set that aside and let that flax absorb that hot water while we get other things ready. But first off, as you know, my cookbook is out. And here it is, same cookbook with my not for sale sign on it. Let's put this over here. Back in the pig napkin holder. So now that our starter is ready to use, it is a babysitting project that you take on when you start to do sourdough. And I am fairly new at it. I've done it with several different flours, which have all been kind of a science experiment in and of themselves. But I chose to show you the brown rice flour because I feel like this flour is easily available at most grocery stores. And it's more cost effective too. It's not one of the more expensive flours that you could try also for experimenting purposes. And then if for some reason it doesn't work out, you're still out the product and the money, but some of the other gluten-free flours are pretty expensive to just experiment with. So day 8, and it's pretty bubbly. If you tap it on the counter, you'll see that bubbles are forming. Hopefully you can see this. And I will say, even though I've been experimenting quite a bit with sourdough, I'm not very good at it yet. And I've done a lot of research. I've done a lot of research on regular sourdough bread. Not because I want to make it, because of course I'm gluten-free, but just to see what the actual process is. I felt like if I had a better understanding of regular wheat sourdough, that it would help me in this new adventure of gluten-free sourdough. Even though I have the expectation that they are not the same by any means, but I just wanted to have an overall understanding of how a sourdough starter works and how sourdough bread works. And there is a lot of information out there on gluten-free sourdough bread, and all of it is very different and sometimes confusing. I mentioned when I was first making the starter that there's quite a bit of information on the amounts that you use, water to flour ratios, and feeding it once a day, twice a day. I have tried different flours doing this. I've tried teff flour, millet, quinoa, brown rice, and sorghum flour. And I've had the most success with the brown rice and the sorghum flour. I was doing a really good job with my quinoa flour, and unfortunately it turned moldy. It was wasteful, which was too bad because quinoa flour is a little more on the expensive side. But it was a learning experience. And I've learned a lot of information that the older your starter is, the more successful you'll be at making bread. This starter is only 8 days old. And I do have some other starters that I've since put in my fridge that I am working on other recipes. And I want to see how it works out with time. If I get better, of course everything is practice makes perfect. But I wanted to see if I would get better at it with an older starter. And so this video is to help you experiment too. And maybe you'll learn things that I haven't learned. And maybe you're already successful at it. And maybe you'll give me some tips and pointers. And it really is kind of a babysitting project, especially the way that I do it twice a day. And of course, if I have time in the middle of the day, I'll check on it and see what's happening. So it is kind of fun, but it is an obligation for sure. So what I'm going to do with this starter is, because it is foamy and ready and bubbling, and even as I tap it, more and more bubbles are coming up to the surface. And as much information is out there about sourdough, there's so many different recipes too. I wanted to make sure it's an easy recipe. It's already a time-intensive process to begin with. It's not hard, it's just time-consuming. But I really wanted to make sure that I didn't need any special equipment or special pans, just things that I already have. And you don't have to have a stand mixer for this, but it really does make easy work of it. Which it will take a long time to rise, especially in my kitchen, in my house, that tends to be on the colder side. Also, where I live here in Utah, it's really dry. So that affects my rise time as well. Of course, we're not even into spring yet, and so it's still pretty chilly. So I might have better success with my rises once warmer weather gets here. But we're really dry here in Utah. So for right now, I have a 3/4 cup measuring cup. And I'm just going to pour in, I'm going to give this a really good stir first. Even though it is bubbly, it kind of separates a little bit. So I'm going to measure out 3/4 cup of my starter. And then I'm going to pour the rest of this into a clean jar. Peel off my tape. Measure out a 1/2 cup of flour. And a 1/2 cup of water. And you don't even have to use a jar. There are some things that are a little hindering about the jar rather than a bowl. But I really do like the jar, that it's tall enough that you can see if it's risen. You use what would be best for you. So now what I'm going to do with this is put my cheesecloth back on. Let this sit out for about 8 hours, and then I'll put a lid on and put it in the fridge. And then what you do if you want to use your starter again, say you wanted to make bread next week. You would take this out, feed it, like I just did, with some water and some flour, and then let it sit out overnight, and that's considered refreshing your dough. And then it would be able to be used in a recipe. And I do have other recipes that I want to make with sourdough. I want to make some sourdough English muffins. I'm really interested in that. I love English muffins. So I will let this sit out overnight, clean up a little bit, and then we'll get to our recipe. 9x5 bread loaf pan, greased and lined with parchment paper. I've read a lot of interesting information about bread pans too. Some of them are very expensive, which I don't have. One of my next experiments will be making this into rolls. And then I've got some plastic wrap here that I've lightly oiled with some olive oil. And then in the bowl of my stand mixer, I've got 3 cups of my gluten-free flour mix. I have 1 cup of potato starch, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, all in there. But I usually put in 1 tablespoon of honey, and this is kefir. This is 1 cup of kefir, which is a cultured yogurt beverage. You could also use buttermilk or just regular milk, but I prefer the kefir. And you want it to be at room temperature, not cold at all. And 1 tablespoon of honey. And then I usually just mix it in with my kefir. And it's okay if it's not even dissolved in there. It just makes it a little bit easier. And then of course our 3/4 of a cup of our sourdough starter, 4 tablespoons of butter, and then of course our flax, which is really interesting too. This flax, ultimately this is what's considered a flax egg. And this will be our binding agent because I'm not putting any eggs in here. But of course I've seen recipes that use the guar gum, xanthan gum, psyllium husk. I've never used psyllium husk before, so I'm not sure how it works. And I've actually tried this recipe with eggs before. And I've also tried it with the flax. And I like the kind of whole grain flavor that the flax adds. And this is thickening up pretty good. So that's ready. Everything else is ready. And you want the paddle attachment. And I'm just gonna give this a good stir, mix all the dry ingredients together before we start adding in the others. And I've seen recipes that say you can do this with a hand mixer if your hand mixer has dough hooks. I've not tried that. My hand mixer doesn't have dough hooks. But this works really good, or you could just do it by hand and use your muscle. I'm going to pour my flax into my kefir and my honey. Give all that a really good stir. Bring everything a little bit closer. And with the mixer on low, I'm going to start adding in my ingredients. And my 4 tablespoons of butter is soft enough to squish it, but not melting. With the mixer on low speed, I'm going to pour in my kefir, flax, and honey. And then my 3/4 of a cup of sourdough starter. And my 4 tablespoons of butter. I'm going to turn the mixer up to about medium high just until it's really well combined and looks fluffy. Once it starts pulling away from the sides like this, I like to make sure that everything is getting mixed in. Sometimes that butter doesn't always mix in as much as you'd like it to. And you can see how it is fluffy and it's holding its shape. That's exactly what we're looking for. And this is where it can sometimes get tricky. And you really have to go by the feel and the texture of your dough. You don't want it to be too dry, but you also don't want it to be too sticky. If it's too wet, you can always add in a little bit more flour. And if it's too dry, you can always add in a little bit more milk or kefir or whatever you're using liquid-wise. But you see, it's really holding its shape. If I let it sit here long enough, it would kind of settle back down, but it's really staying in a nice ball. And I've not done a traditional sourdough bread where it's just the round loaf. I've always done it in a loaf pan. And you can see it really just comes out. And I'm not going to knead it, but I am going to shape it a little bit more into the size that my pan is. And I don't want to flatten it too much. And it doesn't have to really be all the way in there. But it's not super dry, but it's not super tacky. It feels a little bit tacky, but not that it's sticking to my hands, and not dry enough that it's too dry and not really holding together. And now comes the rise time. I'm going to cover this with my lightly oiled, just with olive oil, plastic wrap. And then you want to put this in a warmish, not hot, but a warm, draft-free place. A lot of people choose their oven, not a preheated oven, but just an oven because it's draft-free. Some people use the microwave. I usually will put this, I've tried actually both. I've tried the oven and I've tried the microwave, but today I'm gonna try my pantry and just put it in my pantry and close the door. It's pretty draft-free and kind of warmish, so we'll see what happens there. But in my past experience, my loaves have taken anywhere from 6 to 8 hours to rise. And even then, they don't rise very much before they go in the oven. Every bread I have made with starters have all been just a little bit different. So we'll see what happens with this one. You guys will see it as I do. Warm, draft-free place. I'll pick you back up in about 2 hours. You can see it's not risen very much at all. You can still see my fingerprints where I was patting it down. It is a little bit puffier, but it needs to rise for at least another couple of hours. And of course, it does rise a little bit in the oven too. So not ready to bake yet. I'll pick you back up in a couple more hours. So my dough has been rising for about 5 hours. And I just take a sharp knife, cut down the middle, and I've got the oven preheated to 400. I should have mentioned that first. That will bake at 400 for 30 minutes, and then I'll turn the heat down to 350, flip it around in the oven, and then go about another 30 minutes or so, and then we'll check its temperature and see what we've got. So my bread went in the oven for about an hour and a half. Looks really good, smells really good, sounds hollow, and the internal temperature was at 200. We want to let this cool off completely before we cut into it. And I read that you're supposed to cool it off on its side, so that's what I do. So my bread is all cooled off and ready that we can cut into it. But here's my starter that I fed earlier, as you saw. So what I'm going to do now is take off my cheesecloth. This is actually an old pickle jar, but I like them because it's a really good size and it has a lid. So I'm going to put the lid on. I'll write the date on right here and stick this in the fridge. And then in about a week, I'll see what's happening, probably discard any liquid that might have accumulated, and then I'll refresh it, which is a half a cup of water and half a cup of the brown rice flour. And then I'll cover it again with my cheesecloth and let it sit out for about 8 to 12 hours. And then I'll put the lid back on and put it back in the fridge. Or of course you can use it. But that is already there. I don't know if you can see, but it's awfully bubbly. So now for our bread. Sounds pretty hollow. I'm going to go a little further in than just the end. It looks a little more cakey than lots and lots of bubbles. It does have some bubbles. Tastes like bread. And it's holding together really well. That flax that we mixed with water to give it kind of a jelly-like consistency is really holding it together nice. Even though it didn't rise very much. I would definitely make this again. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of information out there on making sourdough breads, gluten-free sourdough breads specifically. And some of them say that the older that your starter is, the better loaf of bread that you get, such as a month old. This one is only 8 days old. So definitely worth revisiting. And the brown rice flour is just a regular bread flavor. It's nothing too strong, and it's not too heavy of a flour. I've done starters with teff flour, millet flour, sorghum, and quinoa flour. And I will say next to this one, the sorghum is my next favorite. I would say this one is my first choice, and then the sorghum is my next choice. The teff flour is a really dark loaf of bread, and it also is a little bit heavier, and teff flour has a really strong flavor. And so does millet. Millet's more of a yellow bread, and it also has a distinct flavor too. But this one is a really good beginning if you're experimenting with sourdough. I think it would make really good French toast. Even just like this, maybe as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Even though it looks more like a cake, it's not gummy at all. Pretty good though. So I encourage you to experiment. Try making your own sourdough starters and see what you can come up with. You might live in a climate that you get a much better rise than I do, but definitely worth trying. Don't forget, my cookbook is available. I'll put a link below for that. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions or comments, let me know. And we'll see you on the next one.